So I'm going to try and talk fairly quickly about integrating feedback into your grants, focusing on NIH, because that's what people are mostly working on right now. Disclosure slide, I have some disclosures with some organizations, but nothing has anything to do with responding to grants. Here's the learning objectives. You should be able to go through an NIH summary statement and review the feedback in its context, draft responses, and integrate them into the grant. So what's the process for that, and what's the thought process behind it? So first, just the anatomy of a summary statement. Here's a front page of one of mine. They used to call these pink sheets. Some still call them that. This document is what you get from the NIH after your grant is reviewed. This is why they used to be called pink sheets. That's what they used to look like. So here's what's on it. You have your program contact. So this is your main contact for questions about the review. This is the person who was there in the room or was running it. This is your application number. This should be your name or multiple. This grant had multiple PIs, which is why they're there. Your organization, what review group you got sent to, information about your review. So that's what's on this page. What the title was, what your score was, the response to some of these other issues, and then the budgets. That's what the front page is. Obviously, your score is probably the only part of that page you really care about and don't already know. Next is what's called the resume and summary of discussion. This section will only appear if your grant was discussed. Otherwise, it's just missing. It's not there. It's written by the grant review panel after your grant is discussed. So we did this yesterday. Remember how at the end, Jared gave a sort of summary paragraph for each one? That's sort of what this is. It's usually broken into 3 sections. A general description of the project as it was interpreted, which is mostly unhelpful to you because you already know what your grant's about, but it will help you see what they thought your grant was about and hopefully make sure it aligns. It'll have a brief note about important strengths, and maybe the cynic in me doesn't read this one very closely because I don't care what you liked. I mostly care what you didn't like. And then a list of the key issues that were brought up in discussion that need to be addressed. This paragraph is extremely important. And if you think back to yesterday, you'll know why. If your grant was discussed, this is where they list the key issues that impacted your score, often in order of importance, either on purpose or just because that's how the brain works and we organize things that way. Notice that the paragraph he gave was not every comment and criticism that people raised, it was the ones that generated discussion or snagged on the group. So that's why this paragraph, and I'm harping on this section of this paragraph, I think, in my opinion, is the most important part, because that's what gives you direction as to what's most important. Then there's sort of a description of your project. This is just your abstract reprinted here. You wrote it, so there's not much useful information in that section of it. Then you get to the critiques. It's broken out by each reviewer, 1, 2, or 3, and sometimes more than 3 if they're feeling especially sadistic. First are the scores for each section. So they give you all the scores on the different sections. Note that these scores are for informational purposes only and may have absolutely nothing to do with your overall score. There's no correlation, there's no formula, but they can give you insight about where to focus your attention. If you get all 1s and 2s except for approach, that's where you focus. If you got all 1s and 2s except for approach, but your significance score wasn't great, okay, that should give you some focus too. Usually, people say, well, it should be the average or the median or the mean or something. Actually, it's more like whatever your worst score was of all your sections, that's probably closest to what they gave you for an overall score. If all your scores are 1 to 2 except for a couple sections, focus on those. Note that your overall score usually is a reflection of the worst section score, and approach is almost always the most heavily critiqued. Sections will differ by grant type. So ours have different sections than K's. Like K will have a candidate section where ours don't, for example. So then you get into the specific critiques. Most of these begin with a paragraph that includes a general description of the project, some strengths and key weaknesses. This is helpful if the reviewer actually gives a lot of critiques, because it highlights what they actually cared about, because they're not going to relist everything here. They'll list the things that they actually really cared about. Then it goes section by section, listing strengths and weaknesses for each section. Usually it's the weaknesses that matter more than the strengths, obviously. Not all weaknesses have to be addressed in your grant. And not all of them can be, but not all of them need to be. Sometimes people are putting things in there because they don't, it may not necessarily be a weakness so much as it is an imperfection, and all grants have imperfections. So you have to be judicious as to what you do. This is why you use those paragraphs and you use context to figure out what people actually care about. There are other sections of the grant critiques. They'll talk about protection of human subjects. This is important in terms of whether they felt like you missed something in there, and the rules around this keep changing and the formats keep changing. But they if you had an issue with your DSMB, or if they wanted more of a follow-up or whatever, this is where they'll say that. Data and safety monitoring, that's where the DSMB stuff comes in. Inclusion plans, vertebrate animals. This is where they get to critique what you're doing about these things, but it'll be separate from the main critique. So don't miss these, because often there's something really important in these, unless they just said, yeah, all these are fine, and they often will. But if they say something important here, you got to pay attention to it. Okay, so how do you draft a response to reviewers' document? So after you get your summary statement and read it, start working on your RTR. Your RTR is your response to reviewers. The way to do this is you extract each problem identified and copy it and paste it into a document. Copy it word for word, paste it in. Every single separate thing that they had a problem with. If they had one comment that actually had 3 problems in it, split it into 3 bullet points. You want to articulate this as much as possible. So, and in your Word document, indicate its source. So you might want to say, after each one, you'd have like S for summary 1, 2, or 3 for which reviewer it came from, because you're going to reshuffle these, and you might want to keep an eye on where they all came from. So again, even if problems are combined in bullet points, separate them. And if problems are repeated in multiple places, list them repeated anyway, because they might have said it slightly differently in different places, and that might give you some more insights into what they actually want you to do and what the actual problem is. So eventually you're going to condense them, but for now, put it, if it was in the summary and the reviewer put it in their paragraph and they put it as a significance issue and they put it in listed all those times separately, exactly how they wrote it. So now you're going to have a really long list of complaints with your grant. Now sort them by theme. So like put all the stats ones together, put all the put all the measures ones together, or themes may emerge. If there's a certain covariate that a bunch of people harped on, link those together. If there was a certain design issue, like if you had problems with your preliminary data, put that all in the thing, depending on how they aggregate, and you sort of mentally factor analyze these things, cluster them, sort them by cluster. Now you should have a very long document listing out every reviewer complaint, weakness, problem, imperfection. Many of these may be duplicates or even conflict with each other. So next, under each one, draft a response that details what you will do to address the issue, or why you don't think you should address it. Kind of like for a journal article. If you want, you could do a first pass informal approach using all kinds of colorful language and calling reviewers names. Just make sure you delete that before you have the final document. And I only say this half jokingly because the key point here is to get your reactions down in terms of what are you going to do. And as you're responding to these comments, they're going to be organized. So you can see which issues stood out. You're going to see which issues were raised by multiple reviewers. You're going to see which issues were duplicated on your list, either by the same person or by multiple people, so you can maybe condense them. You're going to see what issues were really things you already considered or even included. They just didn't see it or didn't get it. And so based on this, you could potentially combine or eliminate items. So you have your RTR. You've condensed, you've combined, you've sorted all of the gripes, complaints, and comments. You've responded to each one. Your audience is mostly you and your co-investigators at this point, but you can write it as a full draft. It's going to be way longer than what you're going to be able to submit, but it becomes a to-do list. And what I would say is Counter to most of the advice I give in other situations, you have to address the most important items first in your draft, even before the easy ones. And this is important because anything that showed up in this, so especially at something that showed up in that summary paragraph in the beginning, all of those should automatically be labeled as important. That meant that it's likely significantly impacting your score. But the reason for addressing the important ones first, even if there's some low-hanging fruit, ignore those for now. You've got to do the important ones first because they might entail design changes or other changes, especially that impact budget. And before you can go forward, you need to know, can you afford these changes? Someone wants a third arm in your trial and you can't afford a third arm, you're going to have to reshuffle things and retweak things. And you're going to have to solve that problem before you do anything else. Because if this is required, you need to make it fit. So write out all your responses, mostly directed to yourself and co-investigators, that ensures that you've thought through every single one of the issues that were raised. Again, kind of like a response to a journal article. And I, just like Beth was saying, to practice your elevator pitch out loud, even if it sounds silly, write all of these out, even if you know how you're going to respond. But it's a good exercise to write them all out. When you do this, you actually write all of your responses before you actually make any edits to your grant document at all. You want to have you want to know what you're going to change, see if it changes the budget, make any tweaks to the budget that you need to adjust for it, think through every single change, starting with the hard ones and then going through the easy ones, until this document that you have here encapsulates every single complaint and every single solution thought through before you make a single change to your grant. That way, you can lay out a roadmap before you even set out on your journey of revision. So then your RTR becomes your to-do list. First, you make any fundamental changes to your grant that require rebudgeting. It might be a good idea to rerun numbers before even starting on writing revisions. Make sure that these changes are even possible. Again, talking about budget. Once all the fundamental changes to the grant are made, and you've made any budgetary adjustments, there's one more step needed before you can make the additional edits. Meet with your statistician to discuss the changes you made and any additional changes to the design and analysis plan, because there might be some tweaks that you might not have anticipated, or problems that would have arisen, or they might need to rerun numbers. Then, one by one, continue to make all the edits in your grant, trying to respond to every comment. Cross them off as you incorporate them into your draft. After the major changes were made, I do the easiest first, cross that off, and continue through the RTR, asking yourself, what is the next easiest change to make? Okay, what's the next easiest thing I could do? And so then you've got the important stuff out of the way, and then you can optimize your speed of progress. Often, several comments can be addressed with a single change. Many of the issues from grant reviewers will require additional explanation or clarification, which is a problem. With page limits, you probably already just barely met. Don't worry about that for now. We're going to talk about that a little bit. A few more tasks to do. Triple check everything for consistency. Make sure you didn't break anything. Numbering sections or images. How many figure 2s do you have? Is figure 2 now before figure 1 or whatever? Alignments. Make sure if you're doing full justification or left justification or whatever, make sure it's consistent. Adding or removing things. If you removed a measure, make sure it's removed everywhere. If you added a questionnaire to your screening, make sure every time you mention screening, it's in there. If you changed your sample size, make sure that sample size is consistent everywhere, for example. So just make sure everything's consistent. And also call attention to your changes. The rules around this seem to be constantly changing, and it's really frustrating because every time I seem to find an easy way to call attention to changes and redline them, they make that rule illegal. So I don't even know what they are now because they change so much. But if anything, they're trying to make it so that it's harder to change. Lately, what I've been doing is put the revision in a different font so people can scan it really quickly, but it doesn't interrupt their ability to read. But you don't want it to look like a ransom note. So I don't know. I wish you could just highlight changes. You're not allowed to do that. I wish you could redline changes. You can't do that. So we'll see. But you do want to call attention to them because as a reviewer, it's super beneficial to see what you change. Because if I generally liked the grant and didn't like 3 things on the revision, I just want to see if you change those things. I don't want to have to dig through the whole thing again. Some cut some stuff out to address page limits. You're going to need to do this possibly when you do your revisions. Once you've added everything in they've asked you to add, you're now probably over your page limits. Now you got to cut some stuff, and we'll talk about some ways to do that later. And then you got to distill your RTR into an introduction to revised application, or ITRA. And so that's the document that gets submitted with your grant. So a note about saving space. This is a little out of scope, but it's a common issue in revisions. And the reviewers wanted, especially if the reviewers wanted you to add a bunch of stuff, you have no room. So you have to make room. So your first goal should be to find and eliminate excess white space. So do you have a lot of white space around images or tables? Do you have too much space between the paragraphs or at the end of pages? Track down that white space and eliminate it. Use full justification. Disable widow and orphan control in Word. You can find that under page properties, which like if you have a paragraph that bleeds onto the next page, it might move the whole thing to the next page, leaving a bunch of white space at the bottom. Also trim sections strategically. If you can't just eliminate the white space. Also about end of paragraphs. So if you do have spaces in between your paragraphs, I know Beth mentioned just indent the beginning of each one so you have no spaces. So that's one way around it. I feel like that feels too wall of texty, so I like putting a little space. I put spacing at 5 points. The default I think is 6. You reduce it to 5, buys you a few extra lines, and still looks visually fine. But everyone's got their style for that. But then you're going to probably still have to delete things, which is always a gamble because you had to add stuff. And so now you have to delete stuff. But what if you delete something that they wanted? So how do you trim strategically? Well, some things are repeated and could just refer to other sections. So if you maybe just say the one sentence that they really need to hear and say for more information, see blah, 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 or whatever. So here's another one that I use a lot to buy a bunch of extra lines is find paragraphs whose last line is just a few words. Then you have a whole bunch of white space after it. I bet I could find 3 words in that paragraph I can trim to bring that. So that way I gain a whole line by only deleting a couple words. Just another trick I use. And don't forget to maintain visual scannability because scannability means readability, readability means likability, and likability means fundability. A grant that's hard to read, hard to scan, when you look at it, it looks stressful, they're not going to like you. They're not going to like the grant, and they're already going to have a negative emotional reaction whether they realize it or not. So you want to keep it visually clean. Okay, so to end with, I have a few questions here. So number 1, what if the reviewer is wrong? That never happens. Actually, it often happens all the time. I don't know that I've ever gotten a grant review back where the reviewer was not wrong about anything. So it often happens. So instead of saying, well, you should have read the document and you would see that your question was answered, say, we appreciate the opportunity to clarify. Whether you change anything or not at that point is up to you, but you've told them you've clarified, and you can then draw attention to it in the draft and mark it as a change or change something small. If it was already in there, it was already in there. Don't tell them it was already in there. Tell them that you're clarifying and making it more obvious to them. Instead of saying, well, that criticism is blatantly wrong, you clearly have no idea what you're talking about, you should say, we have added additional justification for this choice. That way, if you can't do what they want because it's stupid or it's wrong or it's the wrong approach, at least you're not telling them it's wrong. You're saying, well, we went this way because, and then you just justify it so hopefully they buy it. Instead of saying, you're asking me the impossible, you clearly have no idea how to do this stuff because you're asking me to do something that is physically impossible to do, you say, we've made edits so that the procedures more closely align with the aims and have expanded the problems and alternatives section to address this issue. So what they want you to do is something you can't do. So you call attention to the fact that what you are doing answers the question you're trying to answer in the first place, and that there may have been other approaches, but you can't do them because. So just some, just because you want to, the main one is the first one, that I read this really quickly and I missed this, where they read it as this was not provided or this was unclear. Unclear is their way of saying, I didn't see it, but I didn't read closely enough for to be absolutely sure it wasn't there. Just wasn't clear. And so you can attempt to clarify. Okay, question number 2. What if they don't say anything? This is super annoying. What if you get a score in a section, usually significance or innovation, that's like a worse than a 2, but they list no weaknesses? I see this all the time. It's super annoying. And that's bad reviewing when it happens, but it does. And it means they had a negative emotional reaction to what you were doing, but they had a hard time articulating the specifics. When that happens, you're in danger. And that's because they didn't like it, but they can't tell you why. And so you have to somehow, so what do? First, check to see if their comments in their summary or other sections maybe speak to why they didn't like the significance or what. Usually it's significance where you see this. But you could see it in investigators, you could see it in environment, whatever. See if you can glean it from somewhere else, or try to be a mind reader, because that's apparently what they expect you to do. Because how do you give someone a problematic score without giving them any reason for it? It's really annoying, but it does happen. So the best you could do is guess sometimes. If you're ever a reviewer, please don't ever do this, especially on K awards. I see this all the time, like significance 3, weaknesses none, innovation 4, weaknesses none. I don't know. Okay, question number 3. What if the criticism is vague? The most helpful reviewer criticisms are the ones that are either extremely directive or at least extremely specific about the problem that they had. But sometimes reviewers are coy about what they actually want you to do, and they hint about it, but they don't actually tell you. This is frustrating, but common. And there's some good justifications for this. If you're a reviewer and like, look, there's a million ways to solve this problem, I don't know that my approach is the best. I want to point out that this is a problem, but I don't know how I want you to fix it. I mean, that's fine, but at least you're specific about what the problem is. Addressing this requires some guesswork, but most important comments are regarding your ability to answer the question you're trying to address in your study. So remember that. So if their criticism is vague and you're not sure what they want you to do, go back to first principles and go back to your aims. Are your aims good and clear? And are your procedures and methods aligned with your aims? Are they necessary and sufficient to meet those aims? Question number 4, what if reviewers disagree? Because that happens too. If one reviewer noted a strength that another reviewer noted as a weakness, you have 2 choices. Either ignore the positive comment and address the negative one, or point out the positive one and use that as cover and hope an additional clarification or justification placates the negative one. Remember that you will not likely get all the same reviewers twice in a row anyway, which makes all of this more complicated. So go with the one that's most defensible. So if you have one reviewer liked something, another reviewer didn't, and the one who didn't, it's actually the change that they're making is actually super scientifically sound and you can get away with it, justify it really well, do it. If what they're asking you to do is actually worse and the other person liked it, use it as cover to justify, like, hey, the reviewer 1 liked it and we're justifying it in these 3 ways. There's this other way of doing things, but we're not doing it because. And pick the one that's easiest to defend. Okay, question number 5. What do you include in your introduction? Because you get 1 page to respond to many pages of criticism. So just hit the highlights. Focus on what was in the summary of discussion if you have to choose, because that was the most important stuff. And call attention to the fact that other issues were raised, and maybe name them and address in the revision. You could say, for example, other issues, including matching, randomization, and power, were raised by reviewers and addressed in the application, but you don't really have time to talk about them in that page. So you may want to start by thanking the reviewers. It's polite. Also point out your code for edits in text so they know what to look for. So what that means is, how did you code for edits? Did you change the font? Did you put it in italics? What did you do to draw attention to it and tell them that's what they need to look for? Why wasn't my grant discussed? Not discussed. So this is really important, especially for people just starting to write grants. Not discussed doesn't mean your grant was bad. It just means that at least one reviewer found at least one problem that was for them a deal breaker. For undiscussed grants, responding is harder because you don't have that summary of discussion to distill the issues for you. Instead, try and decode the summary paragraphs for the most important issues and try to address those. And really focus on what was it that were the deal breakers for people. It could be your grant could have been great, except there was one problem or two problems, and you need to make sure you address those. For junior people, reviewers are often trying to protect you from failure. And this I've seen is pretty consistent in every study section I've been on that reviewed career development awards of any kind. Almost never have I seen an exception to the rule that reviewers' comments are coming from the place of trying to protect you. Of like, look, if you don't address these issues, you might be set on the wrong path. If your mentors don't specify these things in their thing, they may not provide them for you and your whole thing may blow up. Or you didn't specify these measures or how you were going to do this. And if I don't know that you can do this, this whole thing is going to fall apart and your career is going to be damaged. I want to protect you from yourself and give you comments that will help you succeed. That's usually the way it is. Often it's a with friends like these kind of situation, but at the end of the day, they are trying to be your friends. And so remember that they're not trying to be damaging or insulting, even if it comes across that way. Scientists don't always have the best social skills, but they are usually trying to help you. And that at least helps couch some of the bad news. I mean, I've seen lots of K awards go from not discussed to funded. So thank you. And with whatever time we have left, I'm happy to take some questions.